Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Citlali guide. Citlali is one of the two newest 5-star characters we got in version 5.3 of Genshin Impact, who was released alongside Mawika and who is a very strong cryo support. In today's video, we're going to talk about Citlali and everything you need to know to get the most value out of her. We're going to cover best builds, artifacts, weapons, team comps, constellations, playstyle, and much more, all in one video. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and excuse the longer than usual delay on this video as 2 5-stars in one half was something I wasn't ready for, but I'll try to be faster. And with that out of the way, let's talk about Citlali. Alright, so starting things off, what does Citlali actually do? Firstly, a big part of Citlali's kit revolves around her elemental skill. This is an ability that will do a lot of different things. Firstly, your skill is a pretty decent shield. While I'll comment more about its exact strength later, for now what you need to know is that it's a shield that'll come out first dealing a hit of AoE cryo damage, then shielding the active character with a cryo shield that scales on Citlali's elemental mastery. This shield will last for 20 seconds and the ability is on a 16-second cooldown, meaning that you will have good uptime on your shielding. Outside of just that, when Citlali uses this ability, she will enter the Night Soul Blessing state and gain 24 Night Soul points. Additionally, her little friend Its Papa will be sitting next to the active character after Citlali uses her skill, and when she has 50 Night Soul points, Its Papa will continuously consume Night Soul points and effectively making a cryo storm around you, constantly dealing AoE Night Soul aligned cryo damage, applying cryo relatively fast. In fact, it's the same speed as Rosaria, 1 cryo app every 2 seconds, which makes this effect great as a way to support your team and enable powerful reactions on other characters. Now, in order to trigger this sort of cryo storm that Its Papa will fire, well, you need to have 50 Night Soul points. As we saw, Citlali's shield will only give her 24, but there are other ways to get more in her kit. Firstly, and most importantly, is her elemental burst. Citlali's elemental burst will first deal a big hit of AoE cryo damage, and honestly, it's a surprisingly big hit. The scaling on the first hit is quite nice. And then afterwards, it will fire off a skull for each opponent inside of the AoE up to a maximum of 3. So it'll do 1 big hit of damage and then 1 to 3 smaller hits, depending on how many enemies you're fighting. While the damage from this ability is definitely nice, especially thanks to a passive talent that we'll get to shortly, a big part of the ability is that it will restore Night Soul points to Citlali. In fact, the first hit of her burst will give her 24 Night Soul points, and then each skull will give 3 Night Soul points. This means that even if you're just fighting one enemy, you will get at least over 50 Night Soul points here, 51 to be exact, just from your skill and your burst, which means you will trigger Its Papa's cryo ability. Now, a few interesting properties to note about this are that this cryo storm that will constantly apply cryo to enemies will trigger once you have at least 50 Night Soul points and will be consuming your Night Soul points at a rate of 8 per second. This means that its exact duration will vary based on how many Night Soul points you have, with your Night Soul point limit being 100. Now, outside of just that though, Citlali also has some very useful passive talents, both for giving her Night Soul and also for pretty big buffs. Firstly, Citlali's Ascension 1 passive will decrease the pyro and hydro resistance of enemies affected by frozen or melt as long as Its Papa is on the field. What this means in practice is that Citlali will synergize really well with both the melt and frozen reactions, decreasing the pyro and hydro resistance of enemies by 20% for 12 seconds. This is really good and a considerable buff to either pyro or hydro carries that you may be running alongside Citlali. Also, you may have noticed that while this Ascension passive helps pyro and hydro damage, it doesn't help cryo, so Citlali kind of betrayed cryo characters in a way, although she can still be played alongside cryo carries in certain teams where there's also maybe a pyro damage dealer, but more on that later in the video. It's just something I wanted to point out. Outside of just that, Citlali will also gain 16 Night Soul points through this effect as you're triggering reactions up to once every 8 seconds. And you can expect in an average rotation to gain either 32 or 48 Night Soul points this way, depending on how long it is. Outside of just that, through Citlali's second passive, she will also gain additional elemental mastery scaling for the damage of her abilities. Her skill's damage will be increased by 90% of her EM, and her burst damage will be increased by 1200% of her EM, which honestly makes it surprisingly strong if you are melting it, which you oftentimes will be. This means that Citlali, even just through an elemental mastery build, can deal a decent amount of passive damage. Outside of just that, this passive will give Citlali 4 Night Soul points anytime a party member triggers a Night Soul burst, which will happen passively. Night Soul bursts are triggered faster the more Natlan characters you have in your team, so you may get more Night Soul points in certain teams versus others, but even with just Citlali in your team, you'll still trigger this effect and you'll still get enough Night Soul points through your skill, burst, and passives. Outside of that, I also wanted to mention that Citlali's normal attacks can be useful if you want to apply cryo from on field, maybe weaving in a normal attack here and there, as they will apply cryo, but outside of that, you're not typically using them as she is an off-field support. Regarding your talent priority, both your skill and your burst are important to level, kind of depending on what you want. Your skill is the most most important to level as far as getting a stronger shield goes, whereas if you want to maximize your Citlali's personal damage, then leveling her burst will be more important. Typically though, you should level both your skill and burst, and you can ignore your normal attacks as you rarely use them, and if you do, it's just for elemental application. Now regarding Citlali's playstyle, it is honestly very straightforward. Citlali is a character who gets a lot of value very easily. All you need to do is really just use her abilities and run her in a team where ideally you'll be either melting or freezing enemies. Citlali personally will also do a lot more damage in a melt team, or provided she can just melt her burst, while also being strong in other teams as well, as while her personal damage is a bonus, it really isn't the main reason why she can be such a strong character, and I'll actually give my thoughts on her power level wise shortly. In fact, what Citlali can do is give you a strong shield, buffs through her kit, especially if you are running a pyro or hydro damage dealer, or at least one of your characters in your team is of one of those elements, while also potentially being able to dish out decent personal burst damage as well in melt teams, and even just outside of that, have access to really strong supportive builds through artifact sets like Hero, and even some weapons like her signature, Thrilling Tales, or others that we'll cover. Citlali is a character who gets a lot of value that way, while also having genuinely good cryo application. As mentioned, it's virtually the same as Rosaria's as far as application speed goes. You just need to make sure you are triggering her Eats Papa's field, which is very easy to do. All you need to do is use Citlali's abilities, her skill, her burst, and then you can just swap out of her, and you will have enough Night Soul points just from that, on top of passively gaining more as you're triggering reactions and Night Soul bursts, which happen periodically. With that said, I do want to talk about Citlali's shield for a little bit, talking about how strong is it and why that's not necessarily the biggest deal. Regarding Citlali's shield, it's one that is decent, it'll protect you, but it won't be as strong as the premier shielders. It's not as strong as Zhongli's, and it's even not as strong as some 4-stars like Layla, Kirara, or Toma. While this will vary based on your stats, you also have to consider that Citlali usually may need other stats such as energy recharge, or may not have an elemental mastery weapon. Now, to be fair, you might be able to stack up as strong of a shield as you can get, and even then it won't be as strong as the other characters that I mentioned, but the point is that as long as you're building some elemental mastery, your shield may not be the strongest, but it will definitely be strong enough. It'll tank some hits for you, and while her kit doesn't have any extra inherent shield strength outside of being especially effective against cryo damage, what Citlali lacks in shield strength, she more than makes up for in buffs and offensive capabilities. I believe Citlali is a defensive character meant to protect your team, but also one that has really good offensive capabilities that you would slot into your team even if you don't really care about the shield. For example, with Mawika, even though Mawika gets a ton of interruption resistance in her burst and does not need to be shielded, hell, her best team even has 2 other healers, Bennett and Shilonen, alongside of her, Citlali still makes her place in that team because she gives good cryo application and also good buffs. For those reasons, while Citlali doesn't have the strongest shield, so I want to kind of be upfront about that. If you really just want the strongest shield, then Citlali's skill won't do that for you. For most content, it's enough, especially if built properly, to prevent you from getting interrupted and tank some damage for you, give you some nice comfort, while especially increasing your offensive capabilities through her passives, artifacts, potentially weapon, and also cryo application. Something I've always said with healers is that you generally don't pick a healer based on just how much healing they have, but also what other utility and buffs they provide your team with. The same can be said for shielders, and Citlali will just give you the most buffs, primarily for melt and freeze teams, on top of having a still genuinely comfy shield, provided you have enough elemental mastery, and even with my pretty mediocre build, my shield was definitely strong enough for me. And so overall, I am very pleased with Citlali. I think she's a character who makes melt a lot more relevant. Obviously, she's a buff to freeze teams too, and just a great support for those reactions, but a lot of pyro carries have mostly preferred vaporize over melt historically, and while Citlali doesn't completely change every team, she definitely fits in to basically any melt team as the best option, while also just being a good slot alongside a lot of different carries. She can be ran alongside pyro units to just either get the occasional melt or to build around melt, also giving big buffs to not just pyro characters but also hydro ones, or characters that deal hydro or pyro damage, namely someone like Chaska. For these reasons, Citlali can be played in more teams than you might think, notably being good alongside almost every pyro carry. Because of the buffs she gives you, the res shred, and everything else, she can be a part of a lot of characters' best teams, with a lot of these characters being at the front of the meta, meaning that Citlali has quite a strong place in the meta. Thanks to some combos that have been optimized, you can get a lot of melts with just Citlali's cryo application if you know what you're doing, for example with someone like Mawika, whose damage gets amplified a lot by someone like Citlali. Outside of that, you can also run her with another cryo support if your team needs more, and she's genuinely someone that I don't think everyone needs, but if you are playing a team that can use her, she can oftentimes be an upgrade to that team, and sometimes sometimes a really big one. And so all in all, Citlali is a character that I'm happy with. I think she's well designed and very strong, making her a character that is definitely a strong support that I can recommend for many teams as being a great buffer and shielder. Obviously, her exact value will depend on who you have and what teams you plan on running, so keep that in mind. But yeah, overall, great support. Now with that out of the way, how do you actually want to build your Citlali? Well, firstly, for your artifact sets, it is very straightforward. Generally, you will be looking for the 4-piece Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City basically all the time. This set is absolutely broken and what makes Natlan supports so good to have in your team, generally speaking. This set gives you energy back from the 2-piece, and then the 4-piece will give you a 40% elemental damage bonus to whatever elements are involved in a reaction that the equipping character triggers. This effect can be triggered even from off-field, and it will buff even the character themselves. What this means in practice is that your Citlali, whenever she triggers any cryo reaction, like notably Melt, she will buff all of your party members' cryo damage by 40%, and then whatever other element you also triggered, stacking with different reactions as well. So if you triggered Melt, you'll get both a 40% cryo and pyro damage bonus for all of your party members. This is really big and definitely the best in slot artifact set for Citlali. Now, if you have multiple Natlan supports in your team, like for example Citlali and Shilonin, well, one of your two Natlan supports is gonna have to run a different set than the hero set, as two of the same set won't stack. Now, generally speaking, you may want to give your other character a different set, like for example giving your Shilonin the Archaic Petra set and keeping Cinder City on Citlali. With that in mind though, if hero's already on another character you're running, maybe another Natlan support you're using, then Citlali can use other sets like Tenacity of the Millith to give an attack percent buff that she can trigger reliably and also make your shield stronger. Mix and matching 2-pieces is technically viable for a stronger shield as well, but it is not recommended, as I would much rather buff my team through an artifact set than just have a slightly stronger shield. With that in mind, Tenacity of the Millith is viable, and Scroll of the Hero of Cinder City is definitely your best in slot set that you will typically be using. Alright, now next up, for the stats you're looking for on Citlali, here's what you need to know. Firstly, as a general support, Elemental Mastery and Energy Recharge are both the ideal stats you're looking for. Elemental Mastery is great because it makes your shield stronger, and it also will increase your damage thanks to your Ascension 4 passive that gives you extra scalings based on your EM, on top of also buffing your reaction damage if you do manage to melt your burst. In most Citlali melt teams, you'll be able to do that, and so Elemental Mastery will give you some damage while also making your shield stronger. Outside of just that though, and kind of most importantly, getting enough energy recharge to be able to burst every rotation is very important in teams where you rely on Citlali's cryo application. This is generally going to be most of her teams unless you're just using her for a shield, so getting enough energy recharge to be able to burst whenever it's available once per rotation is going to be essential. Because you do get some energy from the hero artifact set, you typically don't need that much ER when compared to other supports, but how much you need will vary heavily based on your team and rotation. Typically, you can need anywhere from 150 to 180 ER on Citlali as a general range. In some very energy hungry teams, you might need up to 190, and in others, with another Crow support or a lot of Favonius users, you may need less. Once again though, this will vary heavily based on how energy efficient your team is and also your rotation. Generally though, build enough ER for your Citlali to burst comfortably every rotation. And so in general, you can look for energy recharge and elemental mastery on all of your pieces. If you want to increase your Citlali's personal damage further, then crit rate and crit damage are also valuable substats to just make her deal some more damage. Now for the main stats you're looking for, here it can depend on what you're trying to achieve with your Citlali. If you want to primarily maximize your shielding and also get some damage, then going for elemental mastery on your pieces is ideal. This means going for elemental mastery on your circlet, on your goblet, and then either elemental mastery on your sands as well, or energy recharge if you need more to get your burst back every rotation. Now, if you want to get more personal damage at the cost of some shield strength, you can opt for a cryo damage bonus goblet, which will increase your personal damage. Additionally, a crit rate or a crit damage circlet can be viable as well and can potentially be better for your personal DPS depending on your substats. And so there are a few different viable builds here. You can go hybrid, you can kind of mix and match what works for you, but it kind of boils down to what you value more. If you want a solid hybrid build, a strong shield, and some decent personal damage, then I can recommend prioritizing elemental mastery on most of your pieces. You can go, for example, for an EM circlet, an EM or energy recharge sands, and then either more EM on your goblet for a stronger shield, or a cryo damage bonus one if you want to have a hybrid build where you have some EM on your other pieces, but a bit more damage from your goblet. I will say though that if you want to go full damage, you can also go for a crit circlet, which once again could be better if you just care about your damage. Generally though, I think for most players, elemental mastery will be more recommendable in order to have a strong and comfy shield. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Citlali's best weapons. Now as far as weapons go, I'm actually pleased to say that Citlali does have some incredible options that are accessible to all players. Before we talk about these options though, let's start by talking about her signature weapon. In fact, Citlali's signature is a weapon that will give her a lot of elemental mastery, being nice for both her shielding and her damage, while also giving the active character a 28% damage buff, which is genuinely really nice. A weapon that gives you all the supportive capabilities that you could ask for, enhancing your shield, damage, and on-field DPS's damage as well, makes this your best in slot. Now, with that in mind, while it is good, and I'm sure a lot of people will also be getting it while trying to go for Mawika's banner, as both Citlali's and Mawika's weapons are on the same banner as of right now, it's important to point out that there's actually a free-to-play weapon that gives you a really sizable buff that can sometimes be comparable to her signature. Now, while of course her signature is her best in slot, the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers actually will give you a really sizable buff if you are running an attack scaling carry, which usually will be the case, at least in melt teams. A lot of the characters that Citlali synergizes with do scale with attack, and giving them a 48% damage buff from a 3-star free-to-play weapon is genuinely really good. Now, while this weapon does have some drawbacks, like not strengthening your shield or personal damage, and also having some potential uptime issues as the buff lasts for 10 seconds on a 20-second cooldown, it more than makes up for it. This weapon is one that I've talked about a lot, so you may already know why it's good, but 48% attack is more attack than the main stat of a Sans, so it's a lot of stats, provided you are running an attack scaling damage dealer. It is also worth noting that you can get the full buff from this weapon even if you keep it level 1, but your Citlali won't do nearly as much damage that way, so I don't recommend it. Now, regarding this uptime, if you actually can get good uptime on this, and in a 20-second or longer rotation, you make sure to swap to the right character after Citlali, the buff you're getting can actually be comparable to her signature weapons, and so can your team's overall DPS. Now, even if your uptime isn't that good though, and you're only getting the buff every other rotation, it still is a really good weapon. So while I don't want to oversell it, I want to say that as a free-to-play option, being able to run Thrilling Tales is really nice. Just be sure to swap into your carry after Citlali, lining up your rotation properly. I will say though that if you're someone who isn't thinking too much about the rotation and might give this buff to the wrong character, or maybe you're someone who just values having a stronger shield, then going for a weapon that gives you a lot of elemental mastery, like ones we'll talk about next, can be better suited for you. With that in mind, if you make sure to swap in to your main DPS after Citlali and are running an attack scaling carry, then I can highly recommend Thrilling Tales as a weapon that is very cheap and also gives you just a really big buff that will increase your team's DPS quite highly, only being a little bit behind your signature when you're looking at your team's damage, although you may lose out on a bit of comfort that you can make up for with your artifacts. Now, with that said, there are other catalysts that can help with utility, giving you a stronger shield, damage, and energy. For other options, Sacrificial Fragments is a solid 4-star, giving you a ton of EM and also a chance to reset your skill's cooldown, which will in turn give you more particles, helping alleviate any energy recharge you may need. And overall, Sac Frags is a weapon that I do really like. I think it's probably the comfiest option, at least as far as 4-stars go, as it gives you EM for your shield, and also allowing you to use your skill twice not only will give you your burst back without really needing energy recharge, so it also helps there, but on top of that, it can give you more Night Soul points, allowing you to apply cryo from just 2 skill presses. Outside of that, for a bit more premium options, Nahita's signature weapon, 1000 Floating Dreams, will give Citlali a lot of personal buffs, namely a ton of EM and also some damage bonus, while also giving a small buff to your active character of 40 elemental mastery. The buff won't be as big as Thrilling Tales, but it is still nice, and Citlali gets a lot of personal stats from this weapon, making it recommendable as well. Another weapon I wanted to mention is the Wandering Evanstar, which I mostly recommend if you do have it refined. It can be a good option for Citlali, giving her a ton of EM and converting some of this EM into attack percent that will also be shared with your team. While the buff typically won't be as high as Thrilling Tales, once again, this weapon can make up for it by giving you elemental mastery, which can make for a comfier shield. Outside of that, you can also consider a Favonius Codex if your team needs more energy desperately, and other supportive weapons can situationally be strong as well. Now, to recap on your weapons and give you some form of a ranking, I want to say that I value buffing your team as much as possible, running a supportive weapon much more than just a weapon that will give your Citlali a bit more personal damage or a stronger shield. While a stronger shield can be nice, and maybe that's what you want to go for, which is fine, having more buffs means more team damage, especially if you're running a hyper carry alongside of her, which really does add up and oftentimes will be the best thing you can do. For those reasons, while the best weapon for you may vary, in general, her signature weapon is the best, followed by Thrilling Tales as your best free-to-play option, with Wandering Evanstar and Nahita's weapon being great as well. Sacrificial Fragments is nice for a bunch of EM and also some energy, and other stat sticks are viable as well, but typically less recommended than the best supportive options that I just mentioned. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Citlali's Constellations and how good they are. Firstly, for Citlali's first constellation, this is one that will give Citlali an extra buff through her skill. In fact, once she uses it, she gains 10 stacks of Stellar Blade, with each of these stacks increasing your active character's damage as they do almost any type of damage. This buff is similar to the quills you get from either Shenhe or Shanyun, scaling with Citlali's elemental mastery. Mastery. What this means is that she will give the active character a flat damage buff scaling with her EM that will then scale with the active character's crit and damage buffs, and also reactions such as Melt, which means that you can get just some nice bonus damage from this first constellation. You will get 10 buffed hits through your skill, and you'll get another 3 stacks as you trigger Frozen or Melt up to once every 8 seconds. Outside of just that, using Citlali's skill will reset your Stellar Blade stacks, and this constellation also comes with an extra exploration bonus for Natlan. Moving on, for Citlali's second constellation, this is probably going to be her strongest early stopping point if you're someone who wants constellations, even though obviously she's great just at C0. What this second constellation does is a lot. Firstly, it will give Citlali 125 EM, while also giving any characters shielded by her 250 EM. What this means in practice is that both Citlali and your active character will gain Elemental Mastery, which is great for reaction triggering characters, notably if you're melting. Outside of just that though, as you are triggering Frozen or Melt, she will reduce the Pyro and Hydro resistance of enemies by another 20%, giving her just a bigger res shred overall, and therefore increasing your team's damage. What this means in practice is that your Pyro and Hydro damage dealers will just do more, on top of giving Elemental Mastery to both Citlali for a stronger shield and a bit more damage, and also to your active character being a good constellation overall for reaction triggering main DPSs, primarily for Melt teams, but even some other ones. While this constellation is not needed, it can be a sizable team DPS increase to teams that can make use of the Elemental Mastery and the Pyro and Hydro res shred. So this is definitely her best early constellation. Outside of that, Citlali C3 and 5 increase your talent levels, C3 giving you a stronger shield, and C5 increasing your burst, which is kind of whatever. And then Citlali C4 will increase her personal damage by quite a bit. It will allow her to summon Spirit Vessel Skulls through her skill, and then also give them a big Elemental Mastery scaling, while also giving Night Soul points and energy for Citlali. Because of this, it is good for Citlali herself, and it also generates Night Soul points, which is nice. But in the grand scheme of things, Citlali's not doing the most of your team's damage anyways, so it's not as big of an increase as her earlier constellations. Lastly, for Citlali C6, this is a pretty big effect that will basically make it to where its Papa will be in its Opal Fire state more often, meaning that you can have 100% uptime on your cryo application. And more crucially, you will also gain damage bonus to both your active party member and also your Citlali, up to a 100% damage bonus for Citlali, and up to a 60% Pyro and Hydro damage bonus to all your party members. This means that your Pyro and Hydro damage dealers will be doing more damage, while also increasing Citlali's personal damage and having additional effects, allowing its Papa to stay inside of his Opal Fire state for longer. While it's not a game-breaking C6, it is more damage. Overall, I think Citlali is a really strong character even at C0, so you don't need any constellations, but I'd say that if you want to get some, C2 is the early stopping point that I would go for, as even C1 gives a decent damage increase through the quills, and then C2 gives you a lot of EM and res shred. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about Citlali's best teams. Firstly, as we saw, because Citlali is a cryo shielder who can apply a good amount of cryo from off field, and who will buff both Pyro and Hydro units through the Melt and Freeze reactions, she naturally will have synergy with characters of those elements, triggering those reactions. It is also worth pointing out that even just as a solo cryo support, Citlali will not only allow you to melt certain big hits in your rotation, melt the occasional hit here and there, even if you're not melting every single hit, while also giving you a ton of different buffs and a shield. This is really important to keep in mind, as Citlali will either be ran as a solo cryo in your team to give you these buffs and also some melts, or be ran alongside another cryo unit or even a Hydro one to allow you to trigger more reactions if you're applying too much Pyro. What that means in practice is the following. Firstly, Citlali is great in melt teams in particular. Because of this, she will be good with virtually every Pyro carry. Mawika is the newest one who shines especially with Citlali. Now obviously Mawika is a great character on her own, but Citlali is a part of Mawika's best team, allowing both Citlali and Mawika to melt their bursts, while also melting a lot of your Mawika's big hits, making her deal way more damage. Something to keep in mind, however, with Mawika and some other Pyro characters is that Citlali's cryo application is relatively fast, as we saw. It's the same speed as Rosaria's, but it's not necessarily fast enough to be able to melt every single hit you're doing without fail. Because of this, some teams may want to run another cryo option for consistency, or in the case of many carries, you can also do certain combos to allow you to melt more. For Mawika, for example, there are combos, which I've covered in my Mawika guide, which came out recently, that allow you to get many more melts with just Citlali alone by doing specific combos. You can melt 4 hits instead of the standard 2, and making Citlali's solo cryo application enough. For a team like this, you would run someone like Bennett and then a flexible buffer in the last slot. A similar thing can be said for many other Pyro carries. Gaming is one where Citlali is honestly a big buff for Gaming's melt teams for many reasons. Not only does she give you a lot more damage and great cryo application, but also some much needed defensive utility, which can prevent Gaming from getting knocked around. around. Gumming's a character who synergizes very well with Melt because of how slow but strong his hits are, so Citlali is definitely recommended for Gumming and a buff to him overall. Citlali is also great with Arlecchino for the buffs, shielding, and melts. Something to note about an Arlecchino team though is that your last thought will be flexible. You can either run Citlali as your solo cryo option and then run a buffer or another damage dealer, or you could run a second cryo if you just want more cryo application, but Citlali on her own definitely works here, with the last thought being a very flexible choice, with a buffer like Shilinen or an Anemo support like Kazu or Sucrose working very nicely. Citlali on her own will be enough to enable you to get the occasional melt, although keep in mind that you may have to shift your combo a little. In my testing, doing 5 normal attacks on Arlecchino and then waiting a slight second just for Citlali to reapply cryo so that I can melt it again was enough to make a solo Citlali work and be really strong. Outside of just that though, you can definitely run another cryo option or even a hydro one and then trigger some vaporizes and the occasional melt as well. Other things to note about Arlecchino with Citlali are that 1, your damage is front loaded with Arlecchino, you do more damage at the start of your rotation, and you can ensure that you're melting at least at the start thanks to Citlali, which definitely adds up even if you're just getting the occasional melt. With that said, there are ways to get more melts in your rotation if you know what you're doing, but being able to have a shield and melt some of your hits on top of giving you other buffs is very much appreciated. So Arlecchino is another pyro carry that Citlali works well with, and the same can be said for someone like Yoimiya, where you can fit in Citlali, notably with a hydro option there as well, for the occasional vapes and melts, and Citlali can also be used alongside Diluc. You can either run 2 crowd characters here for a more consistent melting playstyle, but if you are playing a plunge Diluc, which is kind of his best playstyle because he synergizes really well with Shan Yun, then Citlali can help you get buffs and get some melts in. While a solo cryo in this team can make your melting a bit inconsistent, provided you're not plunging too fast, you can, through my testing, still manage to melt Diluc's big hits as he is plunging. You just have to be mindful of the timing and you may mess it up. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it definitely can work, and as always, you could always just run another crowd character or Kazuha as well if you're having trouble melting. Outside of that, other pyro options such as Hu Tao, Yanfei, Linny, or even Klee can all use Citlali one way or another in a team. Hu Tao or Yanfei, for example, can run vape teams with Citlali there to enable the occasional melt, and Linny, while you do want to keep enemies pyroed in order to make the most of his passives, having a shielder for Linny is really nice for aim shotting, and Citlali is one of, if not the best options at that. While Zhongli is also great for Linny, what Citlali lets you do is not only buff your pyro through the hero set and also her passives, as well as maybe giving you a Thrilling Tales buff, but also being able to melt her own burst and especially let Linny get the occasional melts. For example, melting his burst is a nice bonus in damage even though you're not melting everything. That's another thing with Citlali, is that with some pyro characters, some teams you'll be able to melt a lot of big hits, like with Mawika for example, whereas in other teams you may just get the occasional melt on top of all the other buffs, and both of these are fine. So the defensive utility, buffs, and the occasional melt reactions definitely help out Linny, even if there's a bit of counter synergy with your passive. Outside of just pyro carries, Citlali can also be played alongside Chaska, who fires off elemental bullets, and Citlali can help you get great reactions. She will give you buffs to multiple of your different damage types, as well as a shield, and it's just a really good addition to a Chaska team. Personally, I like running either Bennett Farina or Bennett Mawika here, but there's a lot of different things you can do. Outside of just that, Citlali can also be ran alongside cryo carries for either freeze or melt. You can put Citlali in a double cryo freeze team, or a melt one for that matter, where even though she doesn't increase your cryo damage through her passive, it is important to understand a few things. Firstly, she acts as a cryo battery and shielder, but more importantly, the scroll set will buff your cryo damage when you trigger a reaction, so it will help your cryo carry. On top of just that, Citlali also decreasing the hydro and pyro res is relevant for the other characters you're running. Even if your quote-unquote carry or main DPS is a cryo unit, you may have a strong hydro off-fielder or pyro off-fielder for that matter, who may end up doing a lot of the team's damage as well. For those reasons, Citlali can definitely be played alongside a cryo carry like Risley, Ayaka, or Ganyu in a standard freeze or even melt team as the second cryo option. Outside of cryo carries, you can also run Citlali alongside Neuvillette. Neuvillette is a character who keeps getting buffed, like seriously every patch he gets another support, and Citlali is no exception. Citlali is a great shielder for Neuvillette and can be a part of his best C0 team, provided you want some form of defensive utility. Citlali gives you a shield as well as another reaction or element type for your passive, while also giving you the scroll buff and decreasing the hydro resistance of enemies. Citlali is therefore great for a Neuvillette team if you want a shielder there, with the other slots obviously being flexible because it's Neuvillette. Outside of Neuvillette, Citlali can be played alongside other hydro units, provided you're triggering freeze or melt. One example of this is in an Ayato team where Citlali can be a fine option. Regarding Bolani, you can definitely play Citlali here if you want a shielder, but keep in mind that Citlali's cryo may make your reactions a bit more difficult to trigger. Because of this, I recommend having a really fast pyro apply fire, and through my testing with Xiangling, my Mualani was able to vape in her rotation. Keep in mind that you could also just not use Citlali's burst and try not to apply too much pyro if you want to make your vaporizing even more consistent, which should in theory also allow you to run someone like Mawika here if you want to as well. Because of this, Citlali definitely is just another option you can use in a Mualani team, provided you have enough pyro and still allow your Mualani to vape. Outside of that, the sky is the limit. You can even play Citlali in reverse melt quick swap teams, or really just any team that either needs cryo application and a shield, or that's revolving around the melt or freeze reactions, but melt in particular. And so yeah, overall Citlali is a character who I've been enjoying a lot and I'm really happy with as a whole. As far as the showcase goes, because she's a support, I tried to just include some team showcases in the last section instead of just like a full Citlali clear at the end. As always, if there's anything new I want to add, it will be in the pinned comment, as Citlali is a new character, and do excuse the delay as mentioned in the intro, as I really wanted this guide to come out earlier. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoy. Stay tuned for new guides for existing characters and also the new characters coming out, like notably Lanyan, coming in the next half of this very same patch. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.